Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, the fastest growing television service in the Arab-speaking world. Tonight we're discussing the Ukraine, Russia, and its collapsing relationship with Western powers, especially the United States of America, but also some of its key allies, including this one, the United Kingdom. Now, the first point I want to make clear is that the West has been mad at Russia for a very long time. You could say right back to 1917, when the Russian Revolution occurred and the Western allies landed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, not often remembered, in the territory that became the Soviet Union in order to try and reverse the Russian Revolution. Then it became obvious that the Russian Revolution wasn't going anywhere, and so they transformed hot war against the Russians to Cold War. And that Cold War lasted a long time. They got even more mad at the Russians when it was they who conquered Berlin in 1945. They got really mad when the Russians developed a nuclear bomb, ending the monopoly on nuclear weapons held by the United States. Ultimately, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the West began to love Russia for the first time in almost 100 years. They loved it because it was ruled by a drunken fool called Boris Yeltsin, who allowed Russia's national wealth to be privatized and stolen by a whole plethora of plutocrats of the former Soviet Union's nomenclatura, as well as others. Much of Russia's national wealth went abroad, and some of it, quite a lot of it, actually here to London. But the drunker Yeltsin got, the more stupid he got, the more he allowed Russia's wealth to be stolen, the more they loved him. And when he was replaced by President Vladimir Putin, the West got mad at Russia all over again. Because Putin is many things, but the one thing he's not is a pushover. His name's Putin, not pushover. And he has stood up to not just the West, but the oligarchs within Russia itself, many of whom are now in prison. And one of the main political missions of President Putin is to return Russia's wealth back to Russia. So far, so good, as far at least as I am concerned. That's what the Russian people deserve. After all their sacrifice in the Second World War, when they lost 26 million people in that war, it's the least that they deserve, that their national wealth should be their own preserve. I'm making these points because I don't want you to think that this crisis is about Ukraine. It started long before Ukraine. In fact, you can say that it began to peak far from the Russian area itself in relation to the Arab Republic of Syria. You see, the United States and the United Kingdom and France, the former colonial powers, wanted to overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and Russia said no. And Russia made clear in the United Nations, where it has veto power, that they would never allow a repeat of the Libyan fiasco, where a resolution was taken from the United Nations, misused, turned into the opposite of what it said it was, and used to overthrow the regime in Libya with the catastrophic results that everyone has seen. So they began to get even more mad against Putin, even more mad against Russia because of Syria. And by extension, because Russia refuses to go along with the policy of sanction, quarantine, and double standards against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Then came the Ukraine. What happened in Ukraine is widely misunderstood amongst the Western public and deliberately misunderstood by Western politicians and media. They say that Russia has invaded Ukraine. The truth is that NATO invaded Ukraine, and everything that Russia has done since is a response to NATO's intervention in Ukraine. What do I mean by intervention? Ukraine had an elected president and an elected parliament. I didn't care for either of them. They're not my choice. They're nothing to do with me. But they were chosen democratically in an election by the people of the Ukraine. And moreover, another election was due in less than a year. But the Western powers, principally the United States, principally Victoria Nuland, who's now at the State Department but was then the US ambassador to Ukraine, by her own admission, pumped millions and millions of dollars into the protest that became known as the Maidan, which ultimately overthrew the elected president by force, invaded the Ukrainian parliament by force, set it on fire, and held guns literally to the heads of the members of parliament until they agreed to support the dissolution of the parliament, the overthrow of the president. And the first act of this revolutionary new parliament was to outlaw the teaching and speaking of the Russian language in the Ukraine. Now, 45% of the people of Ukraine are Russian speakers. It is a bilingual country. And suddenly, Russian was equated with some kind of terrorist language, and the language banned from all official discourse. The people in the east and the south of Ukraine completely rejected the coup which took place in Kiev. A fascist, right-wing, ultra-Ukrainian nationalist takeover of power was always going to be rejected by the Russian-speaking people of Ukraine. And so they said, well, if Ukraine wants to be led by such people, we don't want to be in Ukraine. We want to rejoin Russia, which of course, in the past, historically, they had been a part of. In Crimea, where the Russian Republic had a treaty in what was called the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, the clue being in the words Autonomous Republic, the people of the Autonomous Republic said, we want to be back with Russia, where we historically always have been. Given that the Russian naval base there was critical to Russia's whole defense posture, Russia supported the decision of the people of Crimea to rejoin their country. And now, in the east and the south of Ukraine, there is full-scale war. It is a war that was chosen by the coup regime in Kiev. It is a defensive war that is being fought by the people of East and South Ukraine. Russia has not invaded Ukraine. If Russia invaded Ukraine, the war would have been over in an afternoon. Because anybody that thinks Russia can be played with militarily doesn't know the facts of life. If Russia wanted to, it could end this war this evening by moving its forces to defend the Russian-speaking people of eastern Ukraine. But it has not done so. Of course, there are Russians helping fellow Russians inside eastern Ukraine, but that's not the Russian state policy. Diplomacy has been the stance of the Russian government from the start. Putin, his foreign minister, all his ambassadors and plenipotentiaries around the world have been trying to find a diplomatic solution to this crisis in a way that would not lead to war. But the West is bent on encroaching on Russia. NATO has constantly advanced closer and closer to the Russian frontier. Well, you don't know the facts of life if you think Russia is going to allow a hostile military alliance to have bases and missiles all around it pointing at it. The Russians reject this, and so they should, and so they must. Sanctions have been imposed upon Russia, just like the ones on Iran, getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And now we have the absurdity in Britain where the language that's being used in the media and in Parliament is like the Cold War, as if Russia were still some kind of communist enemy of Western powers, when it is not. And it's getting dangerous. Just in the last few days, Russian military aircraft flying in international airspace, this is important, flying in international airspace, were buzzed by British Air Force jets and threatened, and the Russian ambassador has been called into the Foreign Office to be given a lecture by the jumped-up Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom, whose name nobody in Britain even knows, wagging his finger at the Russians for daring to fly in international airspace. This from people who are invading other people's countries all over the world, sending their army, navy, air force to bomb and shell and occupy other people's countries all around the world, lecturing Russia about flying in international airspace. That's the backdrop. I've got an audience of gifted professionals and enthusiastic amateurs like me, and the discussion starts after this. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're watching Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London, talking about Russia, the Ukraine, and its relationship to Western power. Let me hear from the audience. Yes, sir. Please, go ahead. Give me your point of view.
Good afternoon, Mr. Galloway. My name is Ahmed. I'm a student here in England of Lebanese background, a place I know you're very fond of. You know, sometimes, Mr. Galloway, I look at the crisis in Ukraine and there's a certain throwback to elements which were active in the former Yugoslav entity, a place which had multiple languages, multiple faiths, multiple religions. To whatever extent you could say surviving in a secular manner. To what extent is the Western neoliberal activity, which was active in the Yugoslav breakdown and summoned them to multiple IMF loans, to what extent are they still active in modern day Eastern Europe and in Ukraine in particular?
Well, I wish I could give you a hug, because that's exactly the situation as far as I see it. Let me reel back. In London, in Bush House, the headquarters of the BBC World Service for many years, every single language in the former Yugoslavia had a special BBC radio station beaming hostile propaganda against Yugoslavia towards it, stirring up ethnic, ancient hatreds, nationalism, to try and break up the country. It was extraordinary. With the whole world to serve, the World Service had a Bosnian radio, a Croat radio, a Montenegrin radio, a Serbian radio. It was a sheer act of war on the part of the British media. They did everything they could to break up Yugoslavia, and they succeeded. And look what the result was. And they're doing exactly the same in the Ukraine, and for exactly the same reasons. Number one, to create daggers pointed at Russia, their old enemy. Number two, so that neoliberal capitalist economics would be the norm there as it is here. They wanted to privatize and to marketize everything that's produced in these countries. That's why they want the Ukraine. It's potentially a big market for them. Most of their goods, most of their energy comes from Russia. They want their share of that marketplace. And they cannot accept in Europe, in the 21st century, anyone could have a different model to them. An economic model, a political model, a social model. Now, the Ukraine, in the Soviet Union, and since the demise of the Soviet Union, was getting along just fine. Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, people of different languages were living harmoniously together. But since this NATO policy of encroaching ever closer to Moscow gathered pace in Georgia, in countries like Poland, in countries like the Baltic republics, Latvia, Estonia, etc., this harmony has begun to break down. The Russian-speaking people feel under threat, and indeed are under threat. And that has destabilized the whole region. And it couldn't be more dangerous, could it? Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons, has potentially millions of men under arms. Why poke a tiger in the eye with a stick through the bars? How can that possibly lead to any good? Yet that's exactly what they're doing. Britain went thousands of miles to the Falkland Islands to defend the rights of 2,300 English speakers there, and fought a huge war with Argentina. If it's all right for us to defend fellow English speakers thousands of miles away in the South Atlantic, why would it not be all right for Russia to defend Russian people, not thousands of miles away, but actually next door as its neighbor? Does that deal with your point?
It certainly does.
Thank you. Who's next? Yes, gentleman in the middle, thanks.
Hi, George. My name's Akib. I'm an economic and politics analyst. What do you think about Putin's speech in Valdai, and how do you think that will affect the situation in Ukraine and the rest of the world?
Just remind us what was said in that speech.
He talked about the new world order and how it cannot carry on the same as it's been doing since World War II. And everyone must be equal in the new world order, otherwise there's no point in making another one, particularly referring to the United States and NATO, where they can go around the world doing whatever they want, and the rules and regulations of diplomacy and international law only apply to other countries and not NATO.
Well, that sounds like the kind of speech I would have made. I agree with it word for word in its entirety. The truth is that there's law for some and a different law or no law at all for others. We see it in the Middle East, we see it in many other parts of the world. I pointed out earlier the contradiction of the Russian ambassador being summoned to the Foreign Office to be lectured for Russian jets flying in international airspace by a country whose soldiers, sailors and airmen have in the last 15 years been bombing, shelling and occupying other people's countries thousands of miles away. I mean, you don't know whether to laugh or cry at that kind of hypocrisy. And there has to be a new world order. There was an order before in which the world was divided between the communist world and the non-communist world. And a certain equilibrium existed because of the danger of mutually assured destruction with two hyper-nuclear armed adversaries facing each other. There were conflicts, but those conflicts had to stay within limits. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a unipolar world in which there was only one hyperpower on the earth, and that was led by an imbecile, George W. Bush. A president, a superpower, a giant, with a president with the mind of a child. That was the most dangerous time we have ever lived through. War, occupation, and the danger of absolute conflagration everywhere. The United States had a new world order planned. It was called the Project for the New American Century, drawn up by the neocons in Washington on the Potomac. And that world order said that no one or any combination of anyone will ever be allowed to be strong enough to confront American power and hegemony in the world. That died on Haifa Street in Baghdad. That died when the Iraqi resistance defeated the United States and British occupation of the country and drove them from their land. And instead of terrifying everyone with American power, which was what the invasion of Iraq was supposed to achieve, it actually emboldened everyone by demonstrating the limits of American power in the world. And now, countries like China, which is now the world's largest economy, Russia, are saying, you're not big enough to push us around. We don't want to be ruled by you. We don't want to fight you. We quite like you. We like your movies. We like your popular music. But we don't want to be you. And we don't want you to rule us. We cannot have a world where one group of powers thinks it has the unilateral right to attack, impose, dictate to other powers. Russia's too strong for that. China's definitely too strong for that. I promise you. They don't want to fight Russia if they've got any sense. And they definitely don't want to fight China. Yet, on the subject of foreign military power being projected, there are United States jets and warships in the South China Sea right now. Now, the clue's in the name, South China Sea. Why would China dream of allowing itself to be pushed around by a bankrupt set of Western countries operating thousands and thousands of miles from their own bases? So, I agree with Putin. We have to have a new set of rules. And those rules have to be obeyed by everybody. And that's what we lack. Who's next? Yes, sir.
حسين بابا طالب كويتي تخصص علوم سياسية. كيف لدولة مثل روسيا أن لا تتوقع بأن تطول هذه الأزمة العالمية في النفط، وليس لديها خطة بديلة لتعيد التوازن الاقتصادي بدلا من ضخ هذه الأموال في البنوك، وكيف تتعامل مع الدول الأوروبية في أثناء هذه الأزمة؟
Well, it's a good question, and I omitted to mention the oil issue in my introductory remarks, so I'm grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to do so now. One of the deliberate policies by which they are trying to degrade and diminish Russia is by deliberately suppressing the price of oil. And they're suppressing it not just to damage Russia, but also to damage Iran and to damage Venezuela. Three great powers, emerging powers, that have, for the moment at least, a substantial reliance on the price of oil. So, I don't want to insult your country, of course, or other Gulf countries, but many of those are ruled by puppets, stooges, who increase production every time the United States asks them to, for whatever reason, even though it's not in their own interest to do so. They are ordered to do so and they accept the order. And that's what they've done. They're keeping production artificially high to make the price artificially low so that countries like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela will suffer economically, which they hope will produce political change inside those countries. But Russia has a plan B. Russia has the closest possible relation with the People's Republic of China, the world's greatest economy and the world's biggest customer for oil, which doesn't have any oil or gas of any appreciable quantity itself. And so Russia has said, well, if you're going to play hardball with us, we'll look to our east and we will deepen and develop our relationship with China. And this is having two effects. One, that the Russian economy and political relations are becoming ever closer to China, but very, very importantly, more and more transactions in the world are being conducted in Chinese currency. You see, one of the tools of American hegemony is that theirs is the reserve currency by default of the world, and certainly the measure of exchange in the oil and gas industry. But why should it be? Why should it be? If Russia and China are to develop into a major trading bloc, why shouldn't they price their commodities in their own currency? More after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television in London. We're discussing this evening Russia, Ukraine, and their relationship to Western power, to NATO. And we're discussing the developing relation between Russia and China as an alternative to Russia's engagement with Europe. Now, Russia would have preferred to be able to look both ways, to develop its relationship to Western countries, which of course are dependent in significant measure in this cold winter on Russian energy, as well as having close relations with China. But if you shut the door on Russia, you might just be shutting the door on Russian gas, because maybe they'll sell it all to China. Now, there's a change potentially in the wind on this. The first point is that countries like Germany are suffering, their economy is suffering because of the sanctions on Russia. Germany is acting against its own interest, very considerably so, by sanctioning Russia at American diktat. But new countries, like the government in Greece, the new Greece, are pro-Russian. And they have already told the European Union they don't support sanctions on Russia. And they're ready to intervene diplomatically, thank God for them, in order to avoid unanimity in the European Union in anti-Russian policies. But that unanimity was already under strain, not just inside Germany, from the working people of Germany who are being thrown out of work and having their conditions depressed to follow a Western dictated policy towards Russia, but countries like Hungary and other former Soviet bloc countries like Czechoslovakia, both the Czech Republic and Slovakia, are beginning to have second thoughts about their initial participation in an anti-Russian bloc. And I'm glad to say that too. Who's next? Yes, the lady at the back.
شكرا لتكون هون، وبحب أتشكرك بالنيابة عن كل الشعوب العربية، خاصة لدعم القضية الفلسطينية، هي القضية المحورية طبعا. وبسألك إذا هل هي روسيا عم بيدفعوها بقضية أوكرانيا ليعزلوا إيران وتبطل تدعم الأسد؟
Undoubtedly, the stand of Russia with Syria against the conspiracy and foreign invasion of Syria was one of the triggers for the crisis between the Western powers and Russia. Russia has a very long relationship with Syria. It has a military naval base in Syria. It needs those warm water facilities, which would not survive if the government in Syria was overthrown. And it's a matter of honor for the Russians. They cannot allow their friend and ally to be torn to pieces by these savages who have assailed it, and they will not do so. And Russia has considerable power in this regard. If not for Russia and China, the Western powers would have been able to use the United Nations in the way that they did in relation to Libya, to mount an attack on Syria. But they were precluded from doing so by the Russian and Chinese vetoes. Therefore, any action they did take was actually illegal, outside of international law, and although they're prepared to do that, they don't actually like being seen in that light. They would prefer if they could have the imprimatur, the endorsement of the United Nations for their policy against Syria. But thanks to Russia's strength and dignity, this has not been possible. That's why I say this crisis long predates the crisis in the Ukraine. Indeed, the crisis in the Ukraine was the West's answer to President Putin's stance on Syria. But it will not prevail. First of all, the Syrian regime is very much stronger than they predicted it was going to be. You'll recall the Davutoglu and other Turkish leaders used to predict that Syria will fall in 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. They kept saying that year after year after year, but it didn't happen. Not just because of Russia's support, but because the Syrian people have taken one close look at ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on, and they don't want to live like that. The Syrian people are not like that. They are a multi-confessional, multi-religious, even multinational state. A moderate Muslim country doesn't want to live like Osama bin Laden in the caves of the Tora Bora. So Syria is not going to fall. And it's not going to fall both because of Putin's support, but mainly because the Syrian people and the vast majority of the Syrian army are Sunni Muslims. The Syrian people are not prepared to allow it to fall. Doesn't mean they agree with everything, of course, in Syria and with the Syrian regime, and neither do I. But if I have to choose between Bashar al-Assad and ISIS, I'm with Bashar, and so are most of the Syrians. Who's next?
أستاذ جورج، بعد وفاة الملك عبد الله وتنصيب الملك الجديد سلمان وإعادة هيكلة الأمراء الداخلين، هل ممكن نشاهد تغيير نسبي في السياسة الخارجية السعودية مع أمريكا والدول الأوروبية؟ وهل ممكن يأثر ذلك على الملفات المحورية في أوكرانيا وسوريا وغيره؟
We're slightly getting off the subject, but I'll deal with it briefly, yeah? It's my fault I led you down this road. Well, first of all, I have to say something that might surprise you. I never hated King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. I met him twice. And within the limits of the rotten dictatorial system that prevails in Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, he was a decent person. He helped me. He helped me to save the life of an Iraqi girl suffering from leukemia, whose fate became emblematic of the plight of all the Iraqis under sanctions. Her name was Mariam Hamza. She's alive today because I brought her to Britain and because King Abdullah paid her hospital bill, which otherwise would have fallen to me and would have destroyed me. So it would be dishonorable of me to say other upon his death, may God have mercy upon his soul. Now that he's gone, I can tell you, I hate the Saudi system from A to Z. But the early sign is a positive one, in my opinion. And it relates to Russia. Bandar bin Sultan has been dismissed, I hope, for the last time. And he's the one who threatened President Putin, threatened him with a metaphorical gun. He said, you might have problems at the Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, but we have some influence with the people who might cause you problems in your Olympic Games. If you change your attitude to Syria, then we can use our influence to stop a terrorist attack upon the Winter Olympic Games at Sochi. Of course, before he had finished his sentence, Putin was booting him out the door, because Putin's not the sort of guy you can threaten. Bandar didn't know that, you see. He thought everybody could be bought. But Putin, in my opinion, cannot be bought. And Russia's dignity cannot be bought. And the dismissal by the new king of Bandar is, for me, a promising sign. And it's an opportunity. Every death, of course, is both an occasion for sadness and an occasion for a change of direction. This is a good time for Saudi Arabia to acknowledge that its policy in Syria has been catastrophically failed. It has catastrophically failed. And moreover, it has conjured forth a Frankenstein monster which threatens Saudi Arabia itself. So this would be a good time for Saudi Arabia to say that the policy we have been following in Syria and in Iraq, for that matter, should be changed. And I hope that they'll take that opportunity to change it. Who's next? Yes, welcome, madam.
Hi, George. My name's Amina Salhi, student. Firstly, would just like to thank you also on majority of people who feel that a lot of people are afraid to speak of what you speak of. So thank you for that. And I've got a question for you, and it's, do you believe that there is any justification for both US officials and Eurozone members who publicly pronounce their commitment to democracy and liberty to assist far-right fascist organizations in Ukraine, such as the Azov Battalion, or is this simply another example of the hypocrisy of Western foreign policy?
Well, it's breathtaking, Amina, and it's worth recalling, especially by one so young as you, that in the beginning of this crisis, American and European elected politicians were on the streets of Kiev amidst violent demonstrators whose purpose was to overthrow the elected government of the Ukraine. Now, these are the people who go to war after war telling us they're doing so in order to introduce democracy. But Ukraine was a democracy. It had democratically elected its government. Yet John McCain, Victoria Nuland, then the ambassador, European politicians from the European Parliament and also from national parliaments were there identifying with what was and became a coup d'etat. So it's breathtaking hypocrisy in which they are engaged. Now, I'm not going to deny that the majority of people in the Ukraine probably support the coup government that they now have. Well, that being so, they will have to grant meaningful autonomy to the 45% of the people who don't. You know, democracy is not just about two wolves and a sheep voting over who's for dinner tonight. The two wolves vote that the sheep is for dinner tonight, and the sheep gets eaten. Democracy is not just about the rights of the majority, it's about the rights of the minority. And 45% is a very big minority. So the only democratic, peaceful solution to the Ukraine crisis is one that recognizes the rights of the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine. And secondly, rejects the idea that the Ukraine can become an armed base for anti-Russian NATO forces and missiles. After all, this you definitely don't recall. In the early 1960s, the United States, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, almost brought the world to an end. An end, literally. I was there. I was lying in my bed, listening to my parents talking about the potential end of the world. That the Soviet Union and the United States were going to fight a thermonuclear war over what? Over Cuba having missiles 93 miles off the United States coast. Now, wise counsel prevailed, not least that of Premier Khrushchev, who withdrew the missiles. Well, if the United States was justified in threatening a world-ending nuclear war over hostile military presence 93 miles from its border, why would Russia accept NATO next door in the Ukraine. Only a fool would believe. After Russia's history, when it lost 26 million people in the Second World War, Russia will never allow any enemy to be around it in its borders. And why would they? Why should they? I'll be right back after this. Thank you very much. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, here in London, discussing Russia and the West and the Ukraine and the rest, with an audience of really gifted people here in London town. Let's take you, sir, next. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Mr. Galloway.
Good afternoon.
My name's Asad Beg. I work as an IT consultant.
Welcome.
First of all, may I say that it's an honour to speak to you, and it's a privilege, and I'm a great admirer of yours.
Thank you, sir.
I follow you on social media, and this is the first time I've actually had the occasion to meet you.
The honour is
So
mine. Thank
it's
you
a
very
great honour. My question is, in the light of the worsening crisis in Ukraine that we're hearing in the news today, what is the likelihood of escalation between Ukraine and the Russian armies into full military intervention on both sides, and the possibility of NATO involvement with the Rapid Reaction Force?
Well, of course, that would be the beginning of what might become a world war. And, of course, would be a nuclear war. So we'd be right back to the Cuban Missile Crisis were that to happen. The Russian armed forces have no intention of entering Ukraine. And as I said earlier, if they did, the war would be over in an afternoon. The Ukrainian armed forces, first of all, are no match for the Russian. And secondly, the willingness to fight on the part of the Ukrainian armed forces is already being demonstrated in their fight, asymmetrical fight against irregular fighters in the east of Ukraine now. They're unable to prevail against the ordinary people with weapons in Donetsk, in the Donbass. They certainly would not be a match for the Russian army, which would finish them very quickly indeed. But were that to happen, and NATO were to respond, then we would be into nuclear war territory. And so I frequently ask the British public this question: are you prepared for the end of Great Britain and everyone in it over who should rule Donetsk? Do you even know where Donetsk is? Do you know that Donetsk is a Russian city which is merely asking that it should be allowed to live its life the way it wants to? Is that really a subject on which you're prepared to die and all your children to die? This is the question that needs to be asked. I confronted a military officer at the Hay on Wye Literary Ideas Festival last year. He had just retired as one of the most senior officers in the British Army, and he said, British mothers and fathers have to get used to the fact that our front line is now Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. I answered, did anybody ask the people of Britain if they want their front line to be Lithuania? I'm not ready to sacrifice my sons for Lithuania. Not at all. And when you put it like that, and that's the way it should be put, because these people are always moving around armies of other people. None of these politicians have any intention of fighting Russia themselves or sending their own sons to fight Russia. They want to send your sons to fight Russia. And of course, it wouldn't be a fight like the First World War, the centenary of which we're now marking. It wouldn't even be a fight like the Second World War. It would be a fight like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the fire we're playing with here. And some idiots are ready to go blindly down the road. Now, I'm sure that the West does not want a nuclear war. I'm sure that Russia does not want a nuclear war. But you don't get wars necessarily because anybody wants them. And the First World War is a case in point. Nobody wanted to fight the First World War. It just was one thing after another, and before long, the momentum was unstoppable. And in the case of nuclear weapons, of course, there's the possibility of accident, of rogue action. Some of the older amongst you will have seen the great Stanley Kubrick film, Dr. Strangelove, in which rogue military officers launch a nuclear attack on the then Soviet Union because they didn't like their politicians being too liberal, too mediocre. They wanted a war, so they started one. That kind of thing can happen. After all, there are aeroplanes flying around us. There are submarines sailing around us, fully armed with nuclear weapons. All it needs is one to be launched. And as soon as it's launched, its answer will be launched. And in an instant, we will all be eviscerated. So the stakes are very high, and people should understand that before they allow the rhetoric and the sanctions to escalate to something much more serious. Who's next? Yes, gentleman at the back.
Hello, Mr. Galloway. My name is Issa Idris, and I'm an international relations student at SOAS University. My question for you is, how do you feel gas will be used as a leverage in an attempt to control Ukraine by both the West and, of course, Russia?
Well, that reminds me, and as a SOAS man, a very fine school, I congratulate you on your place, and I hope you do well there. That reminds me of Donald Rumsfeld's unfortunate comment that it's not our fault that God put America's oil under other people's countries. You see, what you're really saying there is somehow that Russia has an obligation to sell gas to the Ukraine. It does not. It's Russia's gas. They can sell it to whomsoever they want. They can decline to sell it to whomsoever they want. And if they don't want to supply Ukraine, which, by the way, owes Russia billions of dollars in unpaid bills, they have every right to do so. If they did so, which, frankly, if I was in charge of Russia, I would have done so long ago. If they do so, they're accused of using their gas as a leverage, using their gas as a weapon, as if somehow this gas belongs to anybody else except the people whose gas it is. Because Rumsfeld was wrong. It wasn't America's oil. It was Kuwait's oil, Saudi Arabia's oil, Venezuela's oil. It wasn't American at all. They have no right to it at all. They can buy it if Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait wants to sell it to them. So I don't believe that Russia will cut off gas to Ukraine. It's had every provocation to induce it to do so, not the least of which is the failure to pay the bill for the gas they've already had. I think Western dependence on Russian gas is something we should properly take account of. I happen to know that old people in this country tonight, and it's 0 degrees outside, are shivering to death, literally shivering to death, because they can't afford to pay their energy bills because of the profiteering of the energy companies and the neglect of the British government. We should respect the fact that much of our gas is coming from Russia. This is mutual advantage. They give us that which we don't have, and we pay for it. That's how international relations, and that's what you're studying, that's how international relations should advance on the basis of mutuality. Cool?
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Gentleman at the front.
Hello, George. My name is Ayman, and I'm a Palestinian activist based in London. نحن نعرف أو الجميع يعرف أن الحرب الباردة انتهت، ولكن ربما الحقيقة غير ذلك، والدليل هو ما يحدث على أبواب روسيا في أوكرانيا. السؤال هنا: هل تعتقد أن الإعلام الغربي يضع المقاتلين أو سمهم ما تسمهم الأوكرانيين والجيش الروسي في سلة واحدة؟
It's a good question. There's a program on British TV called Gogglebox. My wife and I watch it. It is truly jaw-droppingly unbelievable. The point I'm making is that there is a big mass of the public that doesn't know anything about any of this at all. Last night, we watched an old episode in which the Ukraine was on the news and a family were watching it. And the mother in the family said, "Oh, one of my friends is Uranian." Uranian. From Uranus. This is the level of public knowledge on an issue that might actually lead us to conflagration. In Britain, the media and the political class are the same thing. They're not different things. The media used to describe itself as the fourth estate, but actually it's a part of the third estate. And that third estate is a political and media class. It's not that the state takes decisions about what the media should do, or that the media takes decisions about what the state should do. They don't need a Bilderberg group to decide their line. They don't need the Illuminati or the Freemasons or any other conspiracy theory to coordinate their action. They instinctively face in the same direction. So the only reason we thought the Cold War had ended was, as I said earlier, because Russia was in the hands of a drunken lunatic. And they saw Russia as a dripping roast that they could pick. As soon as Russia didn't have the drunken lunatic, the Cold War began again. Because the Cold War was about keeping Russia in a box. Because they couldn't defeat it in a hot war, they decided to put it in a cold box in the Cold War. Until Yeltsin came, and it could be the most lovable bear. But that didn't last long, because Yeltsin drank himself to death. And so, the Cold War we can live with. It's the hot war that we're worried about, and the hot war might happen. Now, I did deal earlier with this. Let me restate it. If Russia was involved in the war in the war in the Ukraine would be over. Because Russia is a military superpower which fought in 1945 all the way to the Reichstag and was ready to accept any level of casualty in order to defeat their enemy. Russia is an unbeatable force, especially on their own border. Ipso facto, Russia is not involved in the Ukraine war. Russian people are, and other Russian people, ex-servicemen and others, are helping them. As would you. You are Palestinian. You have brothers in other states. If they were under foreign attack, you would help them. As others help you, help the Palestinian people. It's the same thing. It would be entirely unnatural for Putin to say, we don't care a damn what happens to Russian people in the Ukraine. There's a line on a map. Especially as that line on the map was drawn by Russia in the first place. The Ukraine was a part of Russia. Crimea was given one drunken night by Khrushchev to the Ukraine, even though it had always been Russian for hundreds of years before the Russian Revolution. So this artificial line on the map is accepted by Russia, but only if the Russian people are not subject to pogrom. And currently, there is a pogrom. Unfortunately for those making the pogrom, they're losing. and Donetsk airport and other strategic assets are now in the hands of popular militia. Sorry, I cut you off. You wanted back in?
No, I thought you drifted off the main point of the question.
That
but
can happen with me.
I was going to take you back because at the beginning of the program you actually said that Russians are helping fellow Russians.
Russian people, yeah.
And I was hoping that you would elaborate on it, but you already did.
Yeah. Thank you for that. There's more of this coming up right after this. Thank you very much. You're watching Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television with me, George Galloway, in London, discussing Russia, the Ukraine, and the collapsing relations between the West and President Vladimir Putin. Let's go to the front of the room. This lady here, yes.
Hi, George. I am a teacher in London. السؤال باعتقادك هل هناك أو ما يحدث بين أوكرانيا وسوريا ما هو تأثيره على الشرق الأوسط بشكل عام؟
I think it's quite an interesting point that Israel was heavily involved in the coup in the Ukraine. You don't need to take my word for that. You can take the word of Haaretz, the leading Israeli newspaper, which ran interviews with military officers, reserve officers, which everyone in Israel is a soldier or a reserve soldier below a certain age. Israeli reserve military officers openly boasting that they were fighting on the Maidan in Kiev in the coup which overthrew the president of the Ukraine. This despite the fact that Ukrainian fascists, who were a major part, the cutting edge, in fact, of the so-called revolution in Kiev, are notorious anti-Semites who participated in the Second World War when Hitler's forces occupied the Ukraine in the massacre of their own Jewish population. This struck me as maybe the lowest point in the history of Zionism, that Israel was helping Ukrainian fascists to overthrow their government, even though those very same fascists, and they carried the picture of their leader at the time openly on their demonstrations, was herding Ukrainian Jews onto the trains, into cattle trucks, to go to their death in the gas chambers and the concentration camps of Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe. So Israel has a side in this conflict, and their side is the coup administration regime in Kiev. And I really cannot understand why this story is not a major international story, but it is not. There's a disconnect between the actual power to influence the outcome in the Ukraine and the perceived or media-generated position of strength of those who are seeking to besiege Russia. Russia has stood up to much bigger than David Cameron or President Hollande, much, much bigger, and prevailed. And they will prevail again, I'm sure about that. Yes, the gentleman at the back of the room.
Mr. Galloway, would I be right in assuming that America is beginning to make too many enemies for its own good? There is growing resentment in the Middle East, in Russia, also in the Latin Americas, I think a place which doesn't receive as much coverage as it deserves, particularly the pink tide, the leftist, socialist-leaning governments, most notably in Venezuela and Bolivia. Is this relevant to recent American attempts to reignite any sort of diplomatic relationships with Cuba? Would it be fair to say that America is truly now becoming desperate for friends which it has lost in the past?
What a very good point. What is undoubtedly true is that the United States is losing friendship, influence, economic, soft power everywhere in the world. Latin America, that you identify, was for a very long time insultingly described by the United States as our backyard. Well, nobody wants to be anybody's backyard. Backyard's where you put the dustbin, the trash. And Latin America has rejected comprehensively the idea that they are somehow subject to the Monroe Doctrine, by which everything in that hemisphere is dictated from the United States of America. And nowadays, you could not get elected in any Latin American country by campaigning on the platform that you were America's friend. On the contrary, if you're America's enemy, you're much more likely to be elected to power. And even where they're not leftist, they are undoubtedly hostile to American hegemony, to American domination of their affairs. The Middle East is now moved completely out with the United States control. Of course, they have some dictators still in their pocket, but amongst the public opinion in the Arab world, the United States' name is mud. Even Netanyahu is ritually humiliating the American president by his forthcoming visit to the American Congress, behind the back of the American president, behind the back of the Democratic Party, purely on the invite of a partisan figure inside the Congress. Netanyahu is dancing on Obama's grave. In the European public opinion, as has been repeatedly polled in European-wide opinion polls, most people believe that the biggest danger to peace in the world is the United States. Not Putin, not China, not the Arabs, not the Muslims, but the United States. So it's undoubtedly true that whilst you can, by hard power, destroy things, you cannot build anything. If you have no soft power, if your economy is weak, enfeebled, if your culture is becoming rejected, then the only power you have is the power to destroy. And my Iraq analogy earlier obtains here. They had the power to destroy Iraq from the air, but they never succeeded in controlling Haifa Street in Baghdad, where more American servicemen were killed and wounded than any other place in the whole of Iraq. And Haifa Street, for those who know it, is right in the center of Baghdad. So their hard power can destroy, but it cannot build. And by definition, it cannot grow because the American economy is virtually bankrupt. I believe that the days of the American empire are numbered. All empires pass, and we are witnessing the passing of the American empire. I'll be gone, but you and my children will live in an era where nothing in the world will happen without China's agreement. This is a very important point. And it relates to Syria in this regard. William Hague, the foreign minister of Great Britain at the time, when Britain and America were proposing to bomb Syria, told a story, he didn't know I was listening, or he wouldn't have said it, that he had tried to get the Chinese foreign minister on the phone repeatedly to try to persuade him to accept a British and American bombardment of Bashar al-Assad. The Chinese foreign minister refused to come to the phone. He sent his secretary to the phone. And the secretary was diplomatically explaining to Mr. Hague, actually the foreign minister will not be coming to the phone, but I can tell you, there are no circumstances, none, in which China will accept a Western bombardment of Syria. Now this marks the beginning of a seismic change. Because for many years, China was becoming economically stronger and stronger, but was politically weak on the international stage. Those days are past now. So you have China, Russia, Brazil, India, South Africa, Iran, Venezuela, power after power after power that rejects American domination, emerging into the sunlight in new and stronger forms. So I'm convinced, as someone who lived during the British Empire, which passed, that we are now experiencing the end of the American Empire, for which I thank the Lord. Hallelujah.
Good evening and nice to meet you.
And you, sir?
My name's Robin. I was born in Hyson Green, Nottingham in England, of an English father and an Irish mother. I experienced the racism against Irish people early in my life, and at a later stage I worked for an umbrella organisation in Hyson Green, which was known as JIPAC, the Joint Indian Pakistani Afro-Caribbean Organisation, and they ran schemes for the unemployed, employment training schemes, of which I was one of the teachers to help people to start up in self-employment. One of my other hats at JIPAC was that I was the area shop steward for Newpie. This meant that I had to sort of help people who were in difficulty with their work, but a lot of the time there was a lot of difficulty because of the different nationalities of how to get on. I can remember going to the Pakistan Centre with Indian people and heated debates about partition. And I sat with members of the Muslim Council of Britain and heard their view, and I sat with guys from the Punjab and heard their view. Now, with all that we've spoken about today, we've spoken about the mighty powers, the people that have the power to do those things. But what I was looking at on the internet last night, when I thought about today and you, was the charity that you worked for, War on Want, and the founding member, Victor. And the thing that stuck in my mind was the things that he said that were what he really meant. And he said, I'm not pro or anti anybody. That was his sort of drive. And he saw that a brotherhood was the way forward. Now, I can see the hatred in the eyes of people from both Israel and Palestine towards each other for whatever reason. I can see the anger, I can see the tension, but I don't see the projects that are happening in the science sphere where there are Arabs and Israelis working together. I don't see the promotion of ordinary people coming together outside of the political sphere and learning to get along with each other, learning to understand their cultures. And I'd like to see more movements like that, that demonstrate that people can get along with each other irrespective of their differences. Would you say that there are forces like that that are active in this world, that are trying to bring people together rather than get them set apart in conflict?
Well, it's an interesting, if philosophical tangent. If we had more time, I'd go further down it. Up to a point, yes, the Russian and Ukrainian people, though speaking different languages, lived in the same territory for almost 100 years and lived amicably together and had elections that some people liked the outcome of and some people didn't, but they lived as neighbors because the alternative to not living as neighbors is to live as enemies. And living as enemies, as everyone is now finding out in the Ukraine, is easier to start than it is to finish.
This is why I felt I would like to speak, because of you mentioning that earlier. And people one day are getting on the bus with their kids, and the next day they're set apart.
Yeah, it's a fair point. They're set apart by false consciousness. You see, you can't wish it away. There are certain political, local, national, and global realities that you can't wish away. You see, Israelis and Palestinians, even if they were quite saintly, could not elide the fact that Israel is built on top of where Palestine used to be. that the Israeli is living in the house that belongs to a Palestinian. He's occupying land from which the Palestinian has been driven. So no amount of amity or goodwill can negate that central truth.
Accepted.
But of course, we want to persuade Israelis of the folly of living in someone else's house and expecting them to accept it. We want to persuade the ordinary Ukrainian, in the majority, the 55%, we want to persuade them that this path of provocation against Russia can only bring us all ruin and endanger even the peace of the world. We want to persuade them of that. But we can't wait till we've persuaded them before defending our own rights. It's a pity. It would be great if an outbreak of amity could occur in the world. But it would be utopian to imagine that whilst waiting for that outbreak, we can allow atrocity and crime to continue. In the case of Russia and the Ukraine, the world better wake up fast to the fact that we are on a very dangerous path. If you push Russia into a corner, then only disaster can ensue, because Russia will not surrender its legitimate rights as a state, and its natural and legitimate right to protect its compatriots who, by accident of history, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, have ended up as minorities within other states. This is true in the Baltics, it's true in the Ukraine, and it's true even in Moldova, which is currently in the state of Romania, and true in many other places. It's not the fault of the Russian minorities in those places that they have ended up not in the country they were either born in or their parents were born in. We can't do much about that now, but we can and must insist that all the people of these countries are treated equitably and justly, and that's not happening in the Ukraine that emerged from the Western-financed and inspired coup d'etat. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. I've been George Galloway. This is Kalima Horra for Al Mayadeen Television in London. Thank you very much. Thank you.